Hi, in the previous lecture, I explained how Princess Elisabeth of Bohemia raised a challenge to Descartes' philosophy in her correspondence with Descartes. Recall that the challenge was to explain how the mind and body interact with one another, specifically how the mind can affect the body in producing voluntary action. Elisabeth pointed out that such an explanation is needed because on Descartes' account, the mind is an immaterial substance, and so that precludes the usual ways of explaining how one thing can cause an effect upon another. Let us now see how Descartes responds to Elisabeth's challenge. Descartes points out two ways that we can know things about the mind or soul. First, we have knowledge of our own minds through the very act of thinking itself, and that's embodied in the cogito. Second, we have knowledge of the mind or soul through its relationship with the body. Of course, it's that second kind of knowledge that Elisabeth is calling into question. On her account, Descartes doesn't have a good explanation of how the mind can be affected by the body and how the body can be affected by the mind. Descartes here acknowledges that he didn't really address this, and he explains why he didn't address it in his meditations. He writes, quote, "It was because my chief aim was to prove the distinction between the soul and the body. For this purpose, the former alone was use. That is, what was of use was the knowledge that we have of the soul through the soul by itself." Descartes continues and says, "The other, the knowledge that we have through the body's union with the mind, would have been harmful." Now this might seem like a cop-out, but it's important to acknowledge Descartes' aim in the meditations as restricting the scope of his inquiry. One of Descartes' aims was to establish the immortality of the soul, or at least establish that it's possible that the soul is immortal. And his worry was that by talking about how the soul and body relate to one another, that would obscure his account of how they are different. So he really played up the differences between soul and body in the meditations for the aim that he had in the meditations. That doesn't mean that they don't relate to one another. So what Descartes needs to do now is explain the basis upon which we can talk about how body and soul relate to one another. And he does this through what he calls primitive notions. Now, what are primitive notions? Well, it's basically something like a concept or idea that we have, and it's primitive insofar as it cannot be analyzed into parts. Primitive notions are the most basic concepts that we have. And the idea is that we take such primitive notions and put them together to build all the rest of our knowledge. Descartes says that there are 4 different kinds of primitive notions. First, there are the most general primitive notions, and he gives the examples of being, number, and duration. What makes them general is that they apply to body and soul alike. You can count the number of souls. You can talk about how souls endure in time. You can say that souls exist or have being. And you can do all of the same thing with respect to bodies. You can count the number of bodies. Bodies can persist in time. And we can also say whether bodies exist or not. That is, they have being. And so this most general class are basically concepts that can apply to bodies and to minds. Now, the second class of primitive notions apply to bodies only. And the one primitive notion there is extension. It's the most basic concept that we have of what a body is, and that we can use to develop other notions or concepts of bodies. So this notion of extension is something that we use to formulate other concepts such as geometrical shapes, as well as locomotion, since one thing moving from one place to another amounts to going from one place to another and these different places are extended in space. The third class of primitive notions pertain or apply only to the soul. And here, the primitive notion is thinking. Thinking is the broadest notion of what the soul does, and it includes things like doubt, imagination, understanding, perceiving, sensing, and so on. Now, it's the fourth class of primitive notions that's crucial for present purposes. Descartes says that we have a primitive notion of how the body and soul relate to one another, and this primitive notion is the union of body and soul. And that includes how the soul affects the body, as well as how body affects mind. Now, insofar as this is a primitive notion, it means that we cannot analyze how body and mind relate to one another. In other words, we cannot explain anymore how body and mind relate to one another. We can at best describe how they relate, but we cannot give an ultimate explanation. In this very point, Descartes elaborates by saying, quote, "We are mistaken when we try to explain one of these primitive notions by another. For being primitive, each of them cannot be understood except through itself." If we try to give such an explanation, Descartes says that we become confused. We're mixing up things that shouldn't be mixed up. Descartes concludes his response to Elisabeth by saying how it is that we have this notion at all, this primitive notion of how mind and body relate. He says, quote, "We experience in ourselves that we have a particular notion for conceiving of the power by which the soul acts upon the body." Notice he doesn't say that we have an innate idea of the relationship between mind and body. Rather, we have an experience of it. Rather than having an innate idea of how mind and body relate to one another, we are aware of how they relate to one another through the experiences that we have. Through experiences of how the body affects the mind, as in pain and hunger, as well as experiences of how the mind affects the body, as when we make decisions that result in our bodies moving. So what does this all ultimately amount to? It amounts to the point that we can know that the mind and body relate to one another, but we cannot know how they relate to one another, according to Descartes. Now, at this point, you're probably not satisfied with Descartes' response, and as we'll see in the next lecture, Elisabeth was not satisfied either.